guys, in this video we are going to be learning how to do a back stitch. Now a back stitch is super useful in and of that it is one of the best ways that if you're just hand sewing to fix something in your clothing, if you've got a rip or a hole, you can use this to completely close it up and it'll be about as strong as any sort of a stitch you could do on a sewing machine. Sometimes even stronger actually. So it's pretty easy to do, but it takes just a little bit of thinking to be able to figure it out. So I'm going to walk you guys through it. You can see here, I've got my fabric laid out. I've got a needle prepped and ready to go. And then I have my sewing scissors right here so that when I have an extra little knot that I need to trim off, I can do that right at the very end. So I'm going to set my scissors to the side. Now you can see here that I've actually got my needle prepped already. I've got it threaded. I've got a knot in the end of my thread. So I am good to just go ahead and start sewing. And I think what I'm actually going to do is flip this way. So the way that this is going to work is a little interesting. We've got to be mindful of what is the front and the back side of our fabric. So I'm going to start the same way actually that I did for a running stitch, which is I'm going to start with my needle just a little ways in, double check that it's about 1/4 of an inch, and that's just a little big. Okay, the big thing here, more than the specific length, is that you want to make sure your stitches are the same length over and over. So that's a little bit short for 1/4 inch, but I'm still going to use it because truthfully, the smaller your stitches are with a back stitch, the more stable it's going to be. So, to start out, I'm actually going to pull it straight through, just like I did for my running stitch, and I'm actually going to anchor it in the same way. So I'm going to do one more stitch right there. Okay, and pull it forward. And so now I've got a complete loop right there that I've got it on front and back. So here's the thing that's just a little bit different. We are now going to do one more stitch as if we were doing another running stitch. So I'm going to go forward about the same length as I would have if I was doing a running stitch. That was just a little long. Okay, so same length forward, and I'm going to pull it through. And now I'm going to swap to my front side so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so a back stitch is called a back stitch because you technically go backward. So here's the front side of my work. Okay, you can see I've got one stitch length right there. So I'm going to go back to where I've already started sewing, put in my one stitch length going backwards, thus my back stitch. And what that's going to do is give me one long connected seam so that when I pull it tight, you can actually see I've got my two stitches that they make a solid line. All right, now on the back side, this is where it gets just a little bit trickier, guys. On the back side, I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to take my needle forward to where that last stitch ended. And then I'm going to go one stitch length past it. Okay, so, and you can see there, that's about the same length away as my other stitches were. And I'm going to close that gap that I don't currently have anything. So on the back side, I'm going 2 steps forward. I'm actually going to go ahead, pull my thread through to the front side. And then on the front, right, I've got that little gap that I just made. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go one step back so that I connect all of my stitches in a nice straight seam. Okay, and you can see as I pull that through, I've now got 3 stitches all right next to each other that it makes a straight seam. Okay. Back to the back side again, and you can see actually that it has a double length there. It makes a little bit of an extra loop. That's exactly what we want. So on my back side, I'm going to go 1 stitch length forward, another stitch length past it, so I'm going 2 steps forward, poke it through, and then on the front side, I've got that gap, so I'm going to go back again to close it. All right, so I'm going to go 1 step back. Now, once you get comfy with that, I actually really like to do a lot of my stitches for back stitch from the same side. And the reason is, number 1, you don't have to flip it over as many times, but number 2, it's a little bit easier to both make sure that your line is coming in straight and to make sure that they're all about the same length. So you can see there that I've got 2 stitches set up ready to go, and right in the middle is where my last stitch is going to come up. So I'm just going to pull that straight through, give it a nice tug to make sure that it is the whole way through, but not so tight that I'm actually going to pucker the fabric. Okay, and I've got that same gap that I've now got to go back and fix. So I'm going to go 1 step back on the top side, and on the underside I'm going to go 2 stitch lengths forward. Okay, make sure that it's lining up with my other stitches, that I've got that stitch right there, right in the middle, and I'm just going to pull it through. Okay, and as I go, you can see that on the top side, that line of perfect even stitches is getting longer and longer every time I do this. Okay, and let's see, I'll get this stitch set up and then I'll show you my back side again. There we go. Okay, so there's my stitch set up and ready to go. And on the back side, you can see that I'm actually getting those loops that they go through every stitch, and we want that, but that's also why it's on the back side. It doesn't look as nice. Okay, so I'm ready now to go ahead, pull it through. And since this is a demo, I'm just going to do a short little thing of stitching. I'm not going to go the whole way to the end. So for this very last stitch, what I'm going to do is very similar to how I tied off for a running stitch. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, and then I'm going to flip it over to my back side. Okay. And then I'm going to go through that exact same spot a few times, meaning I'm going to go not past where my last stitch ended, just right to it. So you can see there, it's lining up on the underside. This is new. And I'm on the front. Okay, and I'm going to go right back. So I'm going right over the last stitch that I made. I'm making a few loops there so that we've got something secure for my thread to hang on to. Okay, and those 2 loops is probably about enough. And same as how I tied off with my running stitch, I'm going to go under the loops of the thread I've already got there for my stitches. If I catch 1 or 2 little pieces of my thread from my actual fabric, that's okay. Just make sure you can't see it from the front side. Okay, I can't see any of the metal of my needle, so we're doing good. And now what we're going to do is take my thread and just start to loop it around, pull it through. Make that same little knot we had at the end of our running stitch, okay? Now, one thing I am going to throw out there that I didn't include in my last video, but should have, is you need to be mindful as you are sewing of how much thread you have left so that you can make sure you have enough to tie your knot. If you run out of thread, you are going to have to go back a few stitches. You are going to have to unpick it, which is not fun. So it's easier just to make sure that you have about enough thread left over to tie it off, which I find. So first of all, I typically, when I'm sewing for myself, like to leave just a little bit more of a tail. But honestly, so long as you've got about the amount of thread it takes to run it through your fingers, and maybe just a little bit more, that's going to be enough to tie off your thread. So I've got my knot right there on my back side, looking nice and even. So I'm going to trim it close to the knot, but right on the knot. So there's my back side. You can see that it doesn't necessarily look as pretty because I've got my bigger loops. But then when I flip it over to the front, I've got those nice even stitches that if I bring it up just a little closer to the camera, you can see it just looks like a regular seam line. And there is your there is your back stitch.